Hi, a good way to start an international business course would be with the topic of globalization, and this is what we are going to talk about today. But before we start, I would like to try something new, something I didn't do in the previous semesters. To encourage you to watch the entire lecture, I'm going to provide you with a puzzler at the beginning of the lecture and reveal the answer to that puzzler sometime in the middle of the lecture. So this way, if you want to know the answer, you'll have to watch the entire lecture. Hopefully it's not too much to ask. And so today's puzzler will be one that I stole from the Microsoft Corporation that uses this puzzler in one of their infamous or famous job interviews. And so here is the puzzler. Is there a place on Earth from which you can walk 1 mile south, then 1 mile west, and then 1 mile north, and come to the same point where you started? Now, the good answer will contain not only the answer as to where that spot or spots might be, but also how many of them are on planet Earth. All right? I'll reveal some hints as we go along, and then the final answer towards the end of the lecture. All right. Now let's talk about globalization. When I teach this course in class settings, I would normally start with the question of how old globalization is. Now, since I cannot hear your feedback, I'm going to trust that you think about it for a second and then hear my answer. So, how old is globalization? Well, the truth is that globalization is not a single event that happened in human history. We cannot say that this is when globalization started and this is the birthday of globalization. In fact, as Bernstein said in one of his quotes, globalization, it's not an event, it's a process. And since this quote is long and boring, I'm going to switch back to my pictures here. So when we look at the history of globalization, you would see that it's not really 500 years old, but probably not really younger. So the first kind of wave, if you want, of globalization, or first traces of globalization, can be traced back all the way to the 1500s. So those were the first sprouts of globalization. So with colonization, as terrible as it was, it actually promoted some international travel. And so as the British and the French and the Portuguese were colonizing Africa and then parts of Asia and then Americas, more travel and more trade was happening globally. And even though that wasn't quite the globalization as we know it, but that was basically, the grandmother of today's globalization. Then it really took off when the telegraph was invented and when the steam engine was invented. Up until that point, travel of information as well as people and goods across or around the globe was extremely slow. It was not unusual that a king would die in, for example, Europe, and the king's people wouldn't even know about that if they lived in somewhere in the colonies. Literally, it may take months and months before the colonies would know that the king had died or that something else went in the metropolis. Now, when the telegraph was invented, the flow of information was pretty much instantaneous, with the only difference from what we have today is that the flow of information was instantaneous along the wire, but it would take some time by the time the information is disseminated from the point of reception to the rest of the country. But still, it was a huge improvement, and so it made possible to trade more efficiently internationally, to do politics more efficiently on the global scale, and so on and so forth. And then obviously the steam engine made travel of people and travel of goods much faster. It would take several months to sail across the Atlantic with a sailboat, in a sailboat. But once the steam engine was invented, the travel time was cut to about 2 weeks, and then even a little shorter depending on the type of the vessel you were traveling in. On top of that, up until the First World War, most countries wouldn't even require passports or visas to travel or to apply for work, right? So you would just go to another country and you just work. There would be some regulations, but generally there were no restrictions. Like today, if you want to go and work, for example, even in Canada, you as an American citizen, for example, or whatever citizenship you have, you would need to, in most cases, have the international the passport, but then again, depending on your status, you may need a visa, and on top of that, even if you're an American, you can travel without a visa, but if you want to work, you would have to apply for a special work permit. That is the case with me. I have a Canadian passport, but to work in the United States, I actually had to apply for the special work permit. Not so easy. So up until about 100 years ago, all that was not necessary, and so flow of goods and capital was slower than it is today, but less restricted. And then a big break comes. First World War I, then World War II, and during that time, as you can imagine, there was lots of animosity going on. Countries were very suspicious of one another, so travel became not only more difficult for political reasons, but also for safety reasons. I mean, it was wartime. And then obviously the Cold War that followed. So up until the 80s, there was really not that much globalization going on. There was some, obviously, and so like America, for example, was trading with quite a few countries. There were some regional blocks that were developing, but again, the pace was not as high as it is today. So then the big break came. Gorbachev, Soviet Union falls, then other empires follow. Many other countries gain independence from their colonizers, from the British, from the Portuguese, from the French, and so on and so forth. And so as a result, travel becomes easier again, and then telephone, later internet, all those are invented, and they make our life, at least as far as globalization goes, much, much easier. So roughly from the 1990, we see the second big wave of globalization, and the pace is really increasing. So we see more and more of that stuff going on. You probably, when you check your emails today, I bet you got emails from several countries. I definitely get about 20 countries a day. Maybe because of my profession, but then again, obviously, this is the nature of the business today, right? So here is a quote in case you're interested in that stuff. Now, here is another surprise that I want to offer you. So as the syllabus says, if you watch my video lectures, the added benefit is that you not only get the material, but you get to preview 5 questions that are very likely to appear on the exam. In fact, I guarantee you that from each lecture, one of the 5 questions will be on the exam in exactly the same form. The other 4 probably not, or maybe in a modified form, but they are exactly the same in terms of the difficulty and in terms of the format. So if you watch my video lectures, you'll have not only seen some of the questions before the exam, but also you will have a very good idea as to what an exam question might look like. And so here is your first question. And obviously the best answer is A. So it kind of started around the 1500s, but it's been a continuous process since then. So we can't really pinpoint a date on the time continuum, right? Now, here is a very interesting video that shows how the world has been developing over the last 200 years. Very interesting one. You have a YouTube link, I guess for you it would be somewhere here, right? So I also posted the actual video file in Blackboard, so if you would like to download the file and watch it there, I recommend it. It's 7 minutes, but it gives you a very good preview, or review I should say, of how the world has been developing over the last 200 years. Now, it's management class, so the big question always will be, how do we make money on it? I love talking politics, I love talking about right and wrong and all those other touchy-feely things, but again, it's a management or business class, and the ultimate question here is, it's all interesting, but how does it help me make money? And so talking about globalization, again, we can fight day and night about whether it's good or bad, but the point is, it is a reality, it's happening, want it or not. And the question is, how can we personally, me and you, make money on globalization? Again, normally I would want to hear your answers, but given that you sit in front of a computer, if you want to just pause now and answer it to yourself, that would be nice, but if not, let's review it together. Well, obviously, thanks to globalized business, you can now significantly expand your consumer base. So you don't have to sell your product only in the city where you are. You can sell it in just basically anywhere on this planet. And so that definitely helps you increase your revenue. Supplier base, the same thing. You don't have to buy supplies locally. You can buy them globally. And so who knows, maybe there is a dude in China that can offer you a much better price than a person or a company in your own town. And so that allows you to reduce cost and maybe get better quality. Partner base, the same thing. So many things now can be done in partnerships with companies all around the world. And again, that's a huge deal. Important that many people don't see is employ world's best talent. So we are now kind of, I wouldn't call it anti-immigration, and certainly not in the United States. I mean, this country is very, very welcoming in terms of immigration. But there are many anti-immigration sentiments in some parts of the world. By the way, including in the United States to some extent, but not quite as much as, for example, what you would see in, let's say, Europe, or maybe parts of Asia, like Japan, or maybe parts of the Middle East, or maybe parts of Africa. But thanks to globalization, you now can basically hire people or recruit people all around the planet. And by doing so, you may get not the best guy from your town, but you may get the best guy from this planet. And this may be a big deal if you're in a business that involves research, development, innovation, where brains matter and matter a lot. For example, this very school has actually a mandate to search for professors worldwide. So when we have an opening for a new professor position, the university must post ads about this opening in all available, or main at least, academic job systems. Academy of Management, Academy of International Business, organizations that have membership in literally hundreds of countries. Academy of Management, I believe as of today, it's 170 countries, so it's pretty much every single country. Academy of International Business, close to that. So by posting your ads through those channels, you ensure that anyone on this planet who is interested in an academic job, if the person wants, the person will find out about that opening. In fact, the year when I was hired, normally the way it works, the ad is posted, and then at the conferences, the representatives of the school conduct interviews and interview candidates, and then they select 3 that they feel are most promising, invite those 3 one by one to campus, and those candidates would meet with the faculty members and give a presentation about their research. In many cases, they would also teach a lecture, like a sample lecture, those kinds of things. And so in the year when I was hired, I don't know what the original pool of candidates looked like, but the 3 finalists were actually all around the world. There was one guy from America who was an American. There was one guy from Germany who at that time studied in the United States, was doing his PhD. And then there was me, who was from Ukraine at that time, living and studying in Canada. And so I'm not sure how exactly it went, but eventually I was the one who was offered the job. And I suspect that probably means that, I was the best of those. And what it also tells me is that if the university was not able to hire globally, they would have settled for someone local, and that local, evidently, would have not been as good as the guys from the overseas. Again, that's presuming that I was really better than the other 2 guys. Who knows? Maybe they were offered jobs and turned them down, and the school was stuck with me, but I suspect that's not how it went. So for companies that do, as I said, research development where innovation matters, ability to hire worldwide matters a lot. But we'll have a few lectures on immigration specifically, so we'll talk about those issues separately. All right, now back to the puzzler. First, let me give you a hint before I give you the answer. Most of you probably have thought about the most obvious answer, which would be the North Pole. If you walk 1 mile from the North Pole south, and then west, and then back north, you will definitely come to the same point. Most people, however, think that this is the only point on Earth where you can have that phenomenon. You walk 1 mile south, 1 mile west, 1 mile north, and you end up in the same point. But this is not the correct answer. It is only one of the many possible correct answers. So if you gave this answer to the Microsoft on your job interview, you wouldn't get the job. You wouldn't even advance to the next round. To advance to the next round, you have to think of more places like that on Earth. So I'll give you the hint in a few minutes. If you can do business over the internet, how can that help you make more money? And again, I encourage you to provide the answers on a piece of paper first. But if you don't want to do that, just bear with me and I'll show you the answers, or some of the answers. So obviously, there are all kinds of ways to make business electronically. And some of the most common ways would be job outsourcing. So you may outsource some functions or some jobs to people in other countries. Call centers would be the best way or the best example. Many times when you now call your bank, someone in India would pick up the phone. So that costs less to the bank. Presumably the bank makes more money and passes on the savings on to you. But then, for example, some hospitals these days outsource x-ray reading to other countries. So you go and you get your chest x-rayed, and the picture is electronically sent to, for example, India. And so instead of 2 days to get the reading of the x-ray, you may get it much faster, and then more importantly much cheaper to you and to the hospital. Global relay. In businesses where time matters a lot, some businesses would have 3 teams working round the clock. So they would have a team of Europeans, Americans, for example, and somewhere in Asia. And so as a result, Americans would work now today, then go to sleep. Then when they do, Asians take over and work for another 8 hours on the project. When the Asians go to sleep, they send the project electronically to the Europeans. The European team works on it, and then when they are done, they send it back to the United States. So when Americans wake up, all of a sudden the project has been substantially advanced. I actually use that all the time with the X culture, and you will see what X culture is. Let me just switch that. Later on in the semester, when we write papers, by we I mean I and other instructors. In most cases it would be co-authors all around the planet, and we use this global relay approach. And so normally when I'm done, I would just put the files in Dropbox, and my colleagues in Asia, Australia, Europe would work on them while I'm asleep, and by the time I wake up I see substantial progress. You can hire people internationally, either permanently or on a project-based basis. Companies that do R&D, it used to be that they would hire engineers or biologists or whatever type of research they do in-house, and so those people would be in-house doing research, from 8 till 5. But what they do now is many of those companies would post problems on the web, and people from all around the world can sign up to complete those projects. So for example, the goal is to break down this specific protein and we don't know how. So if there is a guy somewhere in Japan that may know the answer and wants to work on the problem, the person may sign up for the project. And so usually the price is discussed in advance, and it can be anywhere from $50 to $5,000 to $5 million, who knows. And so by doing so, the company can cut cost on office space, but most importantly, hire help globally and as needed. And then obviously global distribution of services, online learning, all those kinds of things. You're taking my course now, I don't even know where you are. I'm still in the United States for this lecture, but I'm going to Ukraine next week, and we'll spend a major part of the semester in Europe this time. And so I will still be able to deliver the lectures as I do, as if I'm just a few meters away from you. The same way, if you will happen to be traveling during that time, again, you can continue taking this course, even though geographically you may be far away. Some professors actually now experiment with the Second Life, which is almost like a video game slash Facebook. And so the difference between Facebook and the Second Life is that in addition to posts that you type, there is actually an avatar. So you almost like, play a video game, but you is you, just your avatar represents you. And so some professors now teach classes where they design the classroom, and students show up for the class in the form of their avatars. And so they would see the classmates, not the real ones, the electronic ones, but they would ask questions and have discussion. So it's very much, like a face-to-face experience. Obviously, one of the advantages of distance learning is that you don't have to be on a specific schedule. I create this lecture when I have time, and you watch it when you have time. If it's Second Life, we all have to be on the same schedule, so we all have to come to the classroom at the same time. But that's an option, and again, wouldn't be possible without a business. Some other examples of how globalization is used are a little controversial, and I'm not sure what your personal opinion about that would be, but I'm just telling you about the trends, and you decide if it's good or bad. I'm not the judge, and I kind of like the development, but again, I know that some people would disagree with me. So for example, surrogate mother search now goes to India. Some couples, when they can't have kids, they have a number of options, and one of them would be to use a surrogate mother, so whereby the wife's egg and the man's sperm are fertilized and placed in a womb of a surrogate woman or mother, and so that other woman basically buries the child, carries the child, and buries the child, and gives birth to a child, right? And so the family then keeps the child, which is genetically their own, and just somebody else was pregnant with it. And so that is a very costly procedure. In the United States, it may cost anywhere between $30,000 to $60,000 and more. In India, it may cost only about $2,000 to $6,000. Plus obviously cost of transportation and living there. But with the total, all the expenses paid, it may be somewhere between $10,000 plus and minus. And so many families from the United States now actually go to India for this procedure because it's substantially cheaper. And India is becoming almost like, an expert in this field. So their hospitals and, the way they provide this service is no worse than that in the United States. Yet, as I said, it's much cheaper. And so here's a New York Wall Street Journal article about this trend. And so you have pictures of one family that is a traditional family, one family that is a family of two men. And so both families were able to kind of get children that way. And so again, some people widely disagree with the trend, others like it very much. I guess, I wouldn't judge unless you had to be in a situation where you have to, use surrogates to have a child. And I guess then you would have a whole new perspective on the trend. Now, other ways that business or globalization can hurt your business. I mean, we've talked about all the wonderful things that businesses enjoy due to globalization, but are there any negatives? And again, write down your answers if you will, but I'll give you some of the answers that I know of. Well, obviously, competition will be tougher. Not only you'll have more customers and more partners, but you'll also have more competition. It used to be that if you had business in, for example, Greensboro, North Carolina, your competition was limited to Greensboro, North Carolina. No longer, doesn't matter what you do. You may have competitors from China, from India, from Ukraine, from Canada, you name it. And so all of a sudden you have to be competing now with quite a few companies all around the world. And so that may hurt you, may kill you, who knows. Demands become much higher. In many cases, if you have a global base, customer base, you may need to translate your manuals or advertisement in multiple languages. There would be different laws and different customs, and you have to deal with all those things. It's a merciless business. I mean, it's either up or out. Either you become better than everybody else or you are out. And so it's very difficult to become better than everybody else just because competition is tougher. Right? And then at the company level as well as at the national level, competition is not only amongst companies, but also the competition is for talent. Not only competition for customer, but also competition for talent. Countries now recognize that the most value is here, not in the sand. Even though oil and gas is still very valuable, but again, it's more about the men and brain power than about the oil or other resources. And so countries as well as companies are working very hard to attract the most qualified people for positions at their companies or in that country. And again, the war for talent is global. I mean, if you don't offer better deal to a qualified guy, somebody else will, and you may not be able to get that person. Again, in the old days, if you are a company in Greensboro and there is a person in Greensboro who can do your job, that person didn't really have many choices, and in fact you might have been the only potential employer for that person. Today it's very different, and that person may be able and willing to go and take a job at a similar company somewhere in India or in Canada or in France or just about any other country. And again, you have to be competitive not only as a service and product provider, but also as a job provider. Now, I wanted to have a survey here and see what you think about globalization. And so normally I would display the results and we would have some discussion about that. But since I cannot see your answer, I'm just going to tell you what I normally see when I pose this question to 150 students in my class or 200 students in my class. Most students tend to, or the answers tend to converge around D, good. Most people see globalization as a good trend. not necessarily very good, but not necessarily bad. But there are always some people who see it as very bad, more who see it as bad, and there are always some who see it as a very good trend. So what would be the challenges of doing business globally for a company? And again, you might want to think about it first, but here are some of the suggestions. Obviously, you would have to be facing language differences, cultural differences, legal differences, distance in geography, market specifics, all those kinds of things. And so you may have to adjust your products or services or way of doing business to accommodate or account for those differences. For example, Coca-Cola would offer sweeter drinks in Japan because Japanese for some reason like sweeter Coca-Cola. And you've heard all these stories about, beef-free Maharaja Mac in India, and then kosher Big Mac in Israel, and then all kinds of other things. Your book actually has a number of interesting examples. An interesting line of research would be on the name of the service providers that work with customers and how that impacts customer satisfaction. So for example, when you call your bank, for example, and somebody from India picks up the phone, those people sometimes introduce themselves as, "Hi, my name is Prashan," or "Hi, my name is Jimmy." And so studies have shown that when a person introduces himself, herself with an American name to American customers, even though the name is made up and given the accent, Americans kind of suspect that it's not a real name, but the satisfaction is actually higher, surprisingly. Not clear why, perhaps I don't know, you speculate why. But all those little things matter, and again, it's not about whether or not it's ethical or right or wrong. It's about what works and what doesn't, and what poses a challenge. And so these are some of the challenges. You obviously can think of other examples, and so I'm not going to focus on that now. So what drives globalization? We kind of talked about all those things, but we didn't mention some of the important drivers. So we talked about technology, internet, fiberglass, all that stuff, cables, all that stuff makes globalization easier. Transportation is much faster, so by airplane you can cross the Atlantic in like 7 hours. And so all those other things make travel and communication easier. But also, following especially the Cold War and the Soviet Union fall, there has been a dramatic expansion in international, supranational actually, organizations that are tasked with making world more interconnected. And obviously WTO is one of the examples, but then there are many more organizations that do similar work. Some of them would be regional, some of them would be international, like for example NAFTA. It's been around for quite some time, and so the terms of the agreement are constantly revised. But again, thanks to NAFTA, Canada, the United States, and Mexico are much closer together, and in many respects are almost like one country. Far from one country actually, but again, make these three countries much more close to one another. European Union would be a very good example, and the European Union of today is much bigger than what it used to be, as well as much tighter with the common currency, parliament, and all that stuff, right? And then there are similar unions and similar organizations in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, and so on and so forth. Now, thanks to a large extent to the work of governments and those supranational organizations, trade has become easier. So regulations are now much weaker or much more relaxed than they used to be. So barriers on trade are much lower. So for example, tariffs, import tariffs, and keep that in mind because there will be a question about that on the exam. So average tariff has fallen roughly from 40% to 5% over the last 40 years. So now when you import something, again as a customer or as a company, or export something, there would be still some import tariffs, and depending on the product you may still have to pay import tariffs or export tariffs in some cases. But it's about 8 times lower now on average across all countries and all groups of products than what it used to be just 40 years ago. So all of a sudden foreign products become much more accessible, as well as selling your products in foreign countries becomes easier. So when an American company wants to sell a Boeing or any other product, for example, let's say in Japan or United Arab Emirates, the import duties that are now lower make the product much more attractive to the foreign customers. And so are, for example, more attractive products, let's say from China in the United States. And again, we'll have a whole separate lecture on goods and bads of that trend, but the trend is here, and so that's what I'm mentioning. Now here is here is a question for you to make sure that you've been listening to me for the last several minutes. I like this question, and I usually have it on the exam. We'll see if I'm going to have it in the same format this time, but you know, that's a question for you. And the answer is E, decreased substantially. Now, another important question would be, how do we measure globalization? So we know that the world is more globalized today than it used to be. We also know that some countries are more globalized than other countries. But how do you know? How do you measure? How do you express the difference in the degree of globalization? If you have to measure the size of your table, you take a ruler. If you have to measure temperature, you take a thermometer. So how would you measure globalization? It's a tough question, and I'll give you some examples of how it's done today. So, for example, when we talk about the extent of globalization of a particular nation, so-called globalization index, we would be looking at different realms of globalization, if you will. So, globalized in politics, in technology, in personal and economic spheres of life, right? And so, for example, for political globalization, the measures would include whether or not the country is a member of in international organizations, like, for example, United Nations, NATO, whatever else, you know, WTO, participation in different global events such as wars and, you know, things like that. Technological globalization would include measures such as internet penetration, perhaps, you know, accessibility of different technologies for global communication other than internet, things like that. Personal level of globalization, usually they would look at things like international travel in and out of country per capita or per 1,000 people, international phone calls, international marriages, international education, all those kinds of things that basically are about people crossing the border. And finally, economic, we would look at things like, for example, what percentage imports and exports constitute of the total GDP, right? So accounting for the economy, size of the economy, obviously. And so when we look at this picture, surprisingly to many students, the United States comes out as not the most globalized country. It's definitely very globalized as far as technology. So internet penetration is huge, though not as big as in some smaller countries. Like, for example, Bahamas, I believe as of today, have the highest internet penetration rate, so just about every citizen has access to the internet. In the United States, it's still not the case in some areas. And we'll talk about that sometime later, because it's a whole different and interesting story. But then again, the United States, for example, is not very economically globalized. And if you think about that, I wonder if you can come up with a good answer. And the good answer is that the United States is so huge that even though it trades a lot internationally, if you account for the country size, for the size of the economy, actually not that much of American products, or not that much imports and exports constitute in the total GDP of the country. It doesn't mean that Americans don't trade much. Americans do trade a lot, but if you sell something, for example, from LA to New York, in the United States it would still be considered domestic trade, right? If you sell something from, let's say, Cologne to, let's say, Brussels in Europe, even though the product will travel only for a couple of hours, it would be international trade. So effectively what they have there in the European Union is, if you had to count interstate trade as international trade, then obviously your green bar here would be much higher. But again, because the United States is such a big country, much of that movement of goods and services is still domestic, just due to the sheer size of the country. And as a result, the United States doesn't score high on this particular dimension. Here is your next question. And the correct answer is B, in technology. politics obviously to some extent, but again, if you look at those smaller countries, like for example, as we have here, Singapore, Ireland, Switzerland, they are small and they're not as significant as the United States in all, in politics, in personal economic realms. But because the country is so tight, only a few extra phone calls or only a few extra flights to and from the country make a huge difference for the country. And so as a result, as a percentage, they actually tend to win is a wrong word, be more globalized than the United States. Now, here's a very, very interesting video that I strongly encourage you to watch. And again, you have a YouTube link here, but then also I posted the actual file in the Blackboard. You might have read a very interesting book that I strongly recommend by Thomas Friedman that is called The World is Flat. And the main argument of that book is that due to globalization, the world is becoming flatter. So other countries are becoming closer. It's as if we live very close to one another. So there are no mountains between us. But, and that argument is basically that's what we all believe. In fact, if you say that the world is not globalized, people will laugh at you. But some economists believe that it's not really the case. And so here is one of them, a very talented economist. I'm not even sure what school he is at now, but he was at Harvard for a long time, and I believe he's still there. Who says that all this, the world is flat is a globaloni, so it's not really the case. And he looks at some interesting measures of globalization and shows that actually the world is not as interconnected today as many people believe it is. I strongly encourage you to watch this video, only 15 minutes, very educational. It's not going to be tested on the exam, but don't miss, you're a business student, so it's something that you definitely should watch. So time for the puzzler answer. First I'll give you the answer and then I'll explain it to you. When I'll give you the answer, you'll probably be puzzled and you will not believe me. But I'll give you the correct answer and then I will explain it. The correct answer is 1 plus infinity times infinity. So there are 1 plus infinity times infinity points on Earth where you can see this phenomenon. And this is how it works. So 1 is clear. 1, that's the North Pole. That's where we discuss, or the point that we already explained. You go 1 mile south, 1 mile west, 1 mile north, you get to the same point. Now let's move on down a little bit to the south. So first there would be a point on Earth somewhere close to the South Pole, in fact almost a mile away, from which if you go south you will get almost to the South Pole but not quite. And then the circumference around the pole total will give you another mile. So you go 1 mile this way, then you go 1 mile west, which in our case it will be so close to the South Pole, that 1 mile going west will be exactly around the South Pole, and that will give you 1 mile west. And then you simply go back 1 mile to the point where you started, and so you get this 1 mile, 1 mile, 1 mile, and you end up in the same point. So let me illustrate again. You get close to the South Pole, but not quite. You walk 1 mile in the direction of the South Pole, and you have to start from the point that will give you that circumference around the South Pole that is exactly 1 mile. And so you make that circle, each time going west, and then you just go back north, and you end in the same point. Now, that's point number 2. But if you think about it, anywhere on that specific longitude and on that specific parallel line, anywhere you start around the South Pole, you will have that specific phenomenon. So if you started, for example, here, it would be exactly 1 mile around the South Pole, and then again back 1 mile. And since there is an infinite number of points on this line, that's your first infinity. So 1 plus infinity. Then, well, I've given you enough hints. Think where the second infinity comes from, and I'll give you the answer in a few minutes. Now, let's talk about now the touchy-feely side, good or bad. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but let's just review some of the main arguments for and against globalization and then evidence on each of them. In terms of jobs and wages, some argue that globalization allows the rich countries to exploit the poor countries. And then the countries that are, becoming globalized, they start this race to the bottom. The truth is that it's not really the case. The truth is that globalization and, if you will, economic colonization actually leads to improvement in both availability of jobs as well as salaries. Again, I can talk about it all day. Some people have conducted huge studies on the topic, but I'll just give you some simple examples. So, for example, the so-called Asian tigers, Singapore, Taiwan, Indonesia, when they became or started the pace or the path of globalization in the 80s, many people were concerned that the Western companies come there and exploit, the local resources and people. But what was actually going on over time, as those foreign companies were competing for the local labor, the wages actually started growing. And so first it was Japan that went from a fairly poor country to that advanced, rich country, the second economy in the world, or actually now the third, right? Then we saw the same things in other countries like Taiwan, Singapore, that are highly developed countries today. And this is what exactly we see now in China. China has been known for low wages, low labor cost. But actually the wages in China have been growing very, very fast, substantially faster than in the United States. And today they are actually so high that many American companies choose to come back to the United States because it just doesn't make sense anymore to do business in China or to make products in China. Because if you factor in the cost of transportation, it's actually not that cheap anymore. So over time it actually leads to higher wages, better jobs, higher employment standards. And so those stories about sweatshops, probably there is some truth to them, but not that much. I mean, if you look at GM factories in China, it's actually pretty much the same thing as it is in the United States. I'm going to give my own example, me as a customer, me as a citizen, me as a person, or me as a businessman, if you want to look at it that way. So imagine that I need some help with data entry, and imagine that I cannot afford a research assistant here in the United States for $15 an hour, which is more expensive. Imagine that I find someone in India for $1 an hour. If I could, that 100 hours worth of time will actually save me $1,400. This is a big deal. I mean, I can outsource now my job, and that will save me 100 hours with which I can do stuff that others can't do. And this is, by the way, what I've been doing a lot. So sometimes when I can't hire help in the United States, and I haven't done really in the United States, but while I was in Canada, I actually had a couple of research assistants in India whom I would pay directly, and or who would have an account in India because they used to study in Canada, because they used to study in Canada. And even though some people may say that I would shamelessly outsource jobs and thereby deprive Canada of paid jobs, but at the same time I would argue I save a lot of money that I now can spend on other services. And in this specific case, it's $1,400 that I now can spend on, I don't know, a haircut or some kind of service or some kind of product that may be offered domestically. And so by doing so, I increase demand for those products domestically and create jobs domestically. So those are important things. And imagine that I use that extra time to develop an iPad app that I sell 1 million of them for $10 a piece. So in that case, me in this country generates a lot of value and a lot of income by being able to outsource some of the less challenging tasks to people overseas where it costs less. Again, for me as a citizen, that seems like, as a person, as a private person, or as a businessman, that seems to work very well. Yeah, so can for you. So as I was just saying, what many people are concerned about, especially in the developed countries, is that globalization leads to what we call now job outsourcing. And many people see that as a negative trend because what effectively that does is the job could have been in the United States, now it's outsourced to India, so someone in India has a job and we here sit without jobs. What they fail to see is that it's outsourced to India because it's cheaper in India, which means more money is left in our pockets, which means there is more money we can spend now on other products, including on American-made products. And what effectively happens, if you look at the big picture, is that cheaper things that somebody can do cheaper are outsourced so that we can save more money to buy other things and create jobs in other sectors that we wouldn't be able to create demand for had we had to spend more money on the things that we now outsourced. So outsourcing, it's not only about moving jobs, but it's also about savings. It's also about increasing our purchasing power. It's also about creating new demand and, as a result, new jobs. And but again, we'll have a whole lecture on the topic. I talked briefly about labor standards and environment, and again, if you look at the history of globalization and the history of the countries that went through the process, you would see that, contrary to what many people claim, globalization actually improved labor standards and environment. It may not always be the case, though. Like, for example, in China, the dramatic increase in production led to a substantial increase in pollution. That is true. But as per company, or standards in general, actually they improved substantially. It just, due to the increased volume, the overall picture is not as rosy today as it used to be. But it would be the case everywhere, and apparently Americans are trying to expand their economic growth, and as that will happen, even if each company will pollute less per unit of product, the overall pollution probably will increase. And again, it's a controversial topic. We can talk about that a lot, but again, it's not so black as some people try to present, but also not so white as others try to present the issue. This is an opinion question that I would normally use to have a discussion, but I cannot have this discussion with you over the internet. But what you can do, if you watch it and you take my class online, you can write your answer to this question. It's one of those green bonus questions. So all you have to do is write your answers, submit them through the Blackboard, and I'll grade it and give you a little bonus. Income inequality. Again, some people argue that globalization makes rich richer and poor poorer. The truth is that it may be the case at some stages, but generally it actually makes poor richer and rich richer. And I have some stats here. So, for example, when we look at the total GDP of the planet, and when we look at the total international trade volume, both have been increasing. And again, it's not clear which one is cause and which one is effect, but many economists would argue that the GDP has been growing precisely because we trade more. We can go all the way back to Adam Smith, who talked about the wealth of the nations and international division of labor. We'll have a lecture on that, but again, statistics briefly saying statistics shows that globalization actually tends to make everyone richer. And then at the same time, if you look at the last couple of years or few years, when we saw a drop in both international trade and international output, or global output of products, global GDP, I guess, if you want to call it that way. There was a drop at the same time in both trends, as following the crisis of 2008, as countries started trading less, what also happened, countries became poorer, or vice versa. And again, it's not clear which one is the cause and which one is the effect. What's important, though, is that we see a greater growth rate among the countries that are more globalized. So when you look at countries that are interconnected, like Singapore, Taiwan, China, they tend to actually display much greater economic growth than the countries that are not globalized, not interconnected, like some countries in Africa, North Korea, Albania, those more isolated countries. And so what this graph shows us is that if you want to become richer, being globalized is actually a good thing, and imposing barriers on trade actually will not help and most likely hurt you. Here is another question for you. And the answer, the best answer, and again, I wouldn't claim that it's the only correct answer, but the best answer here would be D. More globalized countries become richer. Less globalized countries may actually become poorer. They may be missing on this trend, missing out on the trend. So that's what the statistics shows us. So your final answer to the question. So we know where the first point comes from. We know where the second infinity comes from. But now imagine that you walked a little closer to the South Pole, or a little further from the South Pole. In this case, it would be a little closer, right? And so you got so close that now you have to go twice around the South Pole to get that mile. So you go south, you make 2 half-mile circles around the South Pole, which would be west, and then you go back to the point where you started. So that would be your second possible, basically, infinity. But then you come a little closer, so that the circumference, that circle around the North Pole, will have to be done 3 times in order to get a mile. And then again, anywhere on this line you start, it will be your next infinity. And then closer and closer and closer, up until you have to go 1,000,000 times around the South Pole to get that mile. And so each time on each of those lines you would have an infinity of possibilities. Therefore, the correct answer is 1 plus infinity times infinity. And yes, I could have said just infinity. It would have just not explained the actual components of the answer well enough. So hopefully now, when you will have a job interview with Microsoft, and if you get this question, you will know the answer. Thank you. Finally, one of the major concerns, or more important concerns, about globalization is basically the loss of sovereignty. In the United States, it seems to be less of a concern, but in smaller countries, they are afraid of becoming, globalized or Americanized, as many people call it. And that's to some extent a valid concern. It is true that globalization brings the Western culture, and I don't want to call it American culture, Western culture in general, and makes everyone more like the West. And so many see that as a threat. But then the supporters of globalization say that actually, because of globalization and because of all those international organizations like NATO, like European Union, NAFTA, and so on, countries are actually safer today than they ever were. Before, 100 years ago, one nation could easily swallow or defeat or occupy another nation and nobody would intervene. And that, unfortunately, still happens today, but to a much lesser extent. If you are a member of NATO, for example, it wouldn't be easy to invade you because, the whole bloc will back you up, will support you, will defend you. And so in many cases, while many European nations, for example, are fearing that the European Union, the expansion of EU will deprive them of their national identity and freedom to make choices. Others say, well, actually, thanks to EU, you're now much safer and actually can do much more on your own than you used to because now you are more protected. You're in a better environment. The same applies to culture. Again, some say that globalization will make the world more Americanized, if you want to call it that way. Others say, well, the globalization makes your culture, advertises your culture basically worldwide. I mean, how much did you know about, for example, African drumming or Ukrainian dances before? Now, thanks to globalization, you can find all of that on the internet, and so there is more mixing, more sharing going on, and so some of the cultures that we didn't even know exist now easily accessible, and you can see traces of that in how we design apparel these days, how we design video, movie clips, all that kind of stuff. And so many believe that globalization actually promotes national identities, cultures, indigenous cultures, rather than swallows them. And most likely, the trends are going both ways. But again, there is probably truth. It's not all black. There is also something white to it. Your final question for the lecture. And the answer is B. Advances in information technologies and decrease in tariffs are helping to globalize markets and production activities. This is what you need to know in the exam. At the end of each lecture, I will have a list of things that will be covered on the exam. I promise you that there will be nothing on the exam that is not on this list, so that's for your easy review. If you want to know more, I have a couple more interesting videos, some are longer, some are shorter, on globalization. Here is one, and again the link is on YouTube right here. I also have the file available to you on Blackboard, so I encourage you to watch it. Very educational video. And this one is an interactive chart that shows you how countries have compared to one another in terms of economic growth over time, or size of the economy. And so you can trace it over the last 15 years, over the last 12 years, plus you have a forecast for the next 3-4 years. And you can see how, for example, the United States compares to other countries today as opposed to 10 years ago, and how it will compare 5 years from now. Thank you. That concludes the lecture.